Good afternoon, everyone. Is it clear? I hope. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Aparna Vaidik, Associate Professor of History at Ashoka University, who will speak to us today on the book she has just published, Waiting for Swaraj, The Inner Lives of Revolutionaries of that time, in the years between the wars, the 1920s and 30s, essentially. The subject is especially interesting because they are a disparate group scattered over the country, not members of major organizations and parties and structures, the way the Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Muslim League, the Communists, and so on were. They are a type of people who we recognize from 19th century Europe, essentially. Between the French Revolution and the First World War, or rather even before the First World War, about the 1880s. The time when revolution was an individual free-floating enterprise. Practically anyone could join in, they could form small groups, and they did so right across Europe, from Russia through Poland, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. Not England, obviously. And they created the legend of revolution by the highly individual approach to it, their very loose organizational structures, the small groups in which they worked, and their total commitment, their readiness to sacrifice themselves in a great cause. It is always revolution. What exactly the further consequences of it would be were never clear. And the precise ideology kept shifting. But they would create a revolution, overthrow an existing unjust system, and introduce a heaven on earth. This was broadly their idea. And large numbers of them scattered right across Europe, made several heroic attempts right through. And I think Aparna has worked on a group or groups who belong to that type. And the last manifestation of that type was in India in those interwar years. They were ardent, committed, individual, refused to submit to bureaucratic dictates of big parties, did not want to create huge parties, and always ready to die for the cause. And they did, practically all of them, which is what the story is about. Now, I've had the pleasure of reading the book, and there are two foci to it that I noticed. One is the ideologies that they absorbed or worked out, and it is extremely fluid. Now, Aparna will explain to us how very fluid it was, and how uncertain it is, and how ambiguous it all was. But the sheer uncertainty about their relationship to religion, Marxism, caste, class, all these questions keep coming up. But the other and more fascinating question is their inner lives, which is what the title of the book tells us. What they were internally, what motivated them. And they come across as what can only be described as revolutionary saints. They purified themselves constantly for the great effort. They never ceased to do so. They prepared themselves endlessly for the great event that is to take place. And in this, they were the closest to the Russian revolutionaries, more than anybody else. And among them, their great hero, Peter Kropotkin, who was a purest example of the pure saint amongst revolutionaries, adored by all revolutionaries right across for his saintly qualities. And it's not surprising these people adored him equally. Now, it is this combination of both the ideology and the inner life that I think we are going to hear about. Let me not hold it further. Let me just say what a pleasure it is for me personally to be here today to chair and to hear from a person who was once my student. You might assume that I am very partial for that reason, but my students never thought so when they saw the grades I gave. So it might be work either way. But however, it is a great pleasure to have a former student of mine not only write an excellent book, for me to be able to chair a meeting where she gives us a lecture on the book. Over to you, Aparna.
Thank you, Professor Palat. I'm delighted to be here today. And I want to begin by first thanking Professor Himanshu Prabhari. She guided me through my PhD process, read through my drafts in the end as an Indian Ocean scholar, because at that time I was working on the Andaman Islands and the Indian Ocean. And later she mentored me on how to make a syllabus. So my very first syllabus that I made for myself was with her help. And when I showed her the first draft, she was like, "You can't be teaching like this." So it's sort of, and her mentoring bore fruit later. One of the most successful syllabi I ever made was with her. And then Professor Palat, you already know, I was his student, and he's my Rebel teacher. And all that I know of Russian history is from him. And actually, the conversations with him at the time he was sitting in that dank office in Teen Murti working on Nehru papers, that's the time I had a few conversations with him. And that actually resolved several knots in my thought process and took me back to my days, early days of MA in JNU, where we were looking at Narodniks and Bolsheviks. And the difference between the two was important for understanding this history. Yeah, and I'll come to that, later in my lecture. And I also want to thank Ms. Tete and Vasim. Thank you for your support, and thank you for getting the technology and everything, getting us to do all the dry run and everything. Thank you. Okay, so now about this book, I'll speak 1 or 2, 3 minutes just to contextualize the book, where it is standing in my research life, and the big questions that it is looking at. So this book is part of my larger research on history of violence. Now, my previous book narrated the deep social history of violence and its connection to the spate of lynchings in the last few years. Now, Waiting for Suraj is the second book on the history of violence, and it focuses on the lives of revolutionaries who were active in northern India in the 1920s. And many of you may not have heard of, some of you may have, some of you may not have, of, it's on these two organizations. First one is called Hindustan Republican Association, and the other one is called HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, or Army. So the book is really about the revolutionaries of that period and of those two organizations. And I have a third book, which is coming out next year, which is on the history of the Lahore conspiracy case trial, also known as Bhagat Singh's trial. So my research on violence actually led me to different archives and different places, and resulted in these projects. So the main question in this book that I engage with is regarding revolutionary ontology, or when does a person say, "I am a revolutionary"? What informs their sense of self? So, and this question is important for these revolutionaries because, these are revolutionaries without a revolution. Many of these revolutionaries never threw a bomb or shot anyone or did anything other than live in the revolutionary dens with their other mates. So, in terms of the kind of things revolutionaries are known to do, they didn't do any of that. So, what makes them a revolutionary? Why does that person think I am a Krantikari? So, and then that leads us to the question of who is a revolutionary? When does a historian say that somebody is a revolutionary? Now, my work is part of a burgeoning field of historiography, which is devoted to looking at revolutionism, violence, and torture. Now, these questions about revolutionism and violence and torture was something historians in the 1970s in India were writing about and thinking about. And the early historians to work on this are Professor Chaman Lal, Professor Bipin Chandra, and Bhagwan Josh. Now, these are the people who were looking at it in 1970s, but something shifted with 9/11, and that led to people interrogating or wanting to find out the genealogy of violence. And that's when in last 20 years, and it's interesting that on the as the US forces depart from Afghanistan, it seems that even historiography has gone through this 20-period cycle of examining revolutionism, violence, and torture. And 9/11 was the trigger for a lot of this work. So, like works of Kama McLean, Chris Moffat, Daniel Lem, Dina Heath, Elizabeth Kolsky, Anupama Rao, Taylor Sherman, Martin Miner, Partha Chatterjee. So, there has been a lot of writing on this subject. And my work is well within that historiographical framework. So, okay, now to this book. Now, how have revolutionaries been generally been written about? And this is a question important for understanding how I go about talking about them. Now, revolutionaries generally, when they're spoken about, they're spoken about in heroic terms, and they're shown as people or talked about as people who are ahead of their times, true brave hearts. They are martyrs, sons of Mother India. So that's the kind of conceptualization that goes with talking or writing about revolutionaries. Another one is that of an impatient rebel. Yeah, and this a person who is in hurry, who can't wait for history to unfold, yeah, who has to arrest the speeding wheels of history and turn it in the direction of revolution. That's the impatient rebel. And this has become an explanatory model to understand the revolutionaries and their ontology. And their admirers use this idea of an impatient rebel to valorize them, and their critics use it to depict their politics as immature. Now, this conception of them being impatient is also self characterization that you find in the revolutionaries' writings about themselves. Now, many of these HRA and HSRA revolutionaries loved the Bengali poet Nazrul Islam, and they would often recite his poem Bidrohi, the rebel, that because it captured their state of being. So the first line was Ami Vidrohi Chiru Ashant, I the rebel with a restless heart. So this imagination of impatience and restlessness is the one that is something that the revolutionaries themselves believed in. Now, another imagery associated with revolutionaries is the that of being misguided youth, being these misfits. Yeah, the story of the failed heroes or the tragic heroes. So, in which failure is a telos. So often, and that sort of carries over to the way revolutionism is studied in the context of South Asia, especially India. That it's not seen as something; it's seen as a failed ideology. Yeah, something's missing in it. It's not, and therefore it's not worthy of being studied. So this imagination of revolutionism as a historic failure has been an important image associated with why when with the revolutionaries. And the last frame, another frame that gets entangled with the story of the revolutionaries is the word socialism. Now, in 1976, the word socialism was inserted into our constitution. Now, and a lot of historical writing on the revolutionaries began in the 1970s. And in some ways, the primary works that historians drew on spoke the language of socialism, especially Bhagat Singh's writings. And this language had become popular amongst the revolutionaries after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the revolutionaries that I am working on, I've written on, are from 1920s. So they're very much, many of them are very much speaking that language. And so when historians begin to write about them, they get sucked into this frame of socialism. Yeah, and it gives rise to this notion that revolution then becomes a leftist adage. So and with the binary of right and left, revolution becomes something that the leftists do, and violence is something that the rightists do. So this kind of binary frameworks pervades the early historiography. So these were the imageries that were available to me as I began to work on the revolutionaries. And it is so what the book does is actually takes a walk through these imageries and tries to disabuse the reader of these imageries. Yeah. Now, where does so the first question I asked myself was, where is this characterization even coming from? Why are we thinking about the revolutionaries in this manner? So the answer to that to me that occurred was that the characterization of the revolutionaries as such actually comes from their moments of visibility in the archive. When does the revolutionary become visible to me in the archive? So there are two instances when revolutionaries, because they're mostly underground, these are secret organizations. So when does the revolutionary actually become visible? Now, the revolutionary becomes visible when they drop a bomb, or they carry out a dacoity, or they commit a murder, or are put on a trial. So, and in the colonial records, in these moments, they're either characterized as criminals, or as seditionists, or as anarchists. So that's when they do something spectacular is when they appear in public view. Another way that they appear visible is through the revolutionary propaganda materials that they put out. So the HSRA folks, the revolutionaries associated with this organization, were actually unique in the way they wrote pamphlets, propaganda posters, essays, articles, things like these to propagate their ideas. So their propaganda materials were the metaphorical appearance of these revolutionaries in the public sphere. Yeah, so these are the two forms of visibility, and a lot of the characterization is premised on these moments. Now, what do these moments do for history writing actually? What kind of frameworks do they reinforce if one is writing history using only these elements? Now, these moments of visibility actually reinforce the view of history as an event, or history as an episode, or history as an occurrence. So in the standard school textbooks, you would read of history as revolt of 1857, partition of India, World War II, or the battle of Panipat. So history is thought of as an event. Yeah. And history is not thought of as a process, or anything else. So history is high politics, history is state history, and history is history of events. So now, in this case, the events that bring the revolutionaries into visibility are sensational events, heroic events, highly masculinized events, and therefore seen as politically consequential and worthy of historical inquiry. So, only studying the revolutionaries only through their moments of visibility actually reinforces a certain way of looking at the past, certain way of imagining history. It also leads to a greater emphasis on ideas and ideology as being the driving force behind revolutionaries' actions. So, when I'm using their propaganda material or their political writings as a way of telling the story, then what I'm really emphasizing are ideas and ideology, and they being the driving force. And from this stems a particular view of who a revolutionary is. So the revolutionary then becomes someone who actually reads and writes. Revolutionary is an intellectual. Yeah. And it is through these actions, it is through reading and writing that a revolutionary impacts the world. So what has happened is that because of the focus on the political writings, especially of Bhagat Singh and of others, one has come to see the revolutionary as someone who reads and writes. Yeah, and a revolutionary who throws a bomb or who kills, and a revolutionary is a person who is driven by ideas and ideology. Now this book, in contrast to this kind of a revolutionary, talks about a revolutionary who waits. Yeah, the revolutionary who lives away from the public gaze, whose power lies in remaining hidden. And the image, so this is a revolutionary who waits. Now, the image of waiting evokes is one of like whenever you're thinking of waiting, one thinks of stasis, one thinks of torpor, one thinks of the world coming to a grinding halt. Yeah, basically lockdown. So the imagination of waiting is associated with this idea of lockdown. Now, however, the revolutionaries' waiting was anything but stasis. The waiting was where I show the action was. And waiting was the crucible that forged a revolutionary. And hence the title of the book. I know in the book, the word Swaraj, the font for Swaraj is font size is bigger than waiting, but waiting is what the book actually talks about. And so, where does one go then? If I want to understand their inner lives, if I am trying to understand the revolutionary who waits, where do I actually find their inner life? How does one even go about as a historian piecing it together? Now, the revolutionaries were many of them did not read and write a whole lot, but many of them post independence got down to writing their memoirs, and they did that for a variety of reasons. They did that for correcting the balance of history, getting the narrative straight in the way they saw it. They wrote for posterity. They wrote to themselves remember. So, for a variety of reasons, some revolutionaries got down to writing, and they wrote several memoirs. Many of them went about collecting reminiscences. So, many of them did not write but narrated their lives in revolution. Many biographies were written, and many commemorative volumes were taken out. And all this material together describes in vivid detail their lives in the revolutionary dens, the lives that were lived away from the public gaze. And this book actually draws on several such memoirs and oral history transcripts that are available to us in different archives. So that is what, and that this, because that is a, and this kind of material is different. Yeah, it has its own politics. And one thing I should say here that the material that I'm looking at is primarily in Hindi. Some of it is in Urdu, but primarily in Hindi, and the translations are available in other languages. Okay, so now why have the inner lives not been studied? What is the reason? And that ties back to the way we understand the revolutionaries. Why is it that this writing about inner lives is important, and why, if it is so important, why has it not been worked on? Now, I think the main reason for it is that the revolutionaries that I'm writing about are primarily men. Yeah, and male revolutionaries who were active revolutionaries, or also known as professional revolutionaries, were expected to quit homes and their families. So this gave rise to a general understanding that they were separated from their inner realm. So, and there is also a gendered perception of how we think about inner lives. So inner or quotidian spaces are presumed to be feminine, and therefore many times considered politically inconsequential. What is there to write about inner life? So if one is writing one should write about ideas. So when studying the male revolutionaries, the focus generally is on understanding ideology. Yeah, the search is for the intellectual and the lofty ideas, as opposed to what is seen as mundane or what is seen as everyday. Now, it's not that inner lives of the revolutionaries have never been studied. They have been, but primarily of the female revolutionaries. So there are works of Srila Roy, Kavita Punjabi, Malarika Sinha Roy, Geraldine Forbes, Durba Ghosh, Kama McLean, and Anya Lumba. They have all looked at female revolutionaries and their inner lives. And interestingly, all the scholars identify as women who write about women. So this also goes to show the gendered nature of historiography. Why inner lives of these male revolutionaries have not been attended to. Okay, now something a little bit about the book's narrative, and then I'll tell you what I was able to get out of what do I say about their inner lives. Now, this book is actually using the narrative spindle of the book is coming from Chandrasekhar Azad's life story. Yeah, a revolutionary whose pictures and photographs you see in several places, but there is little actually known about him. Yeah. Now, someone would ask me, why Azad? What makes him? Why should I be choosing him? Why a book on him, or why use his life to enter the story? Now, Azad was one of the rare revolutionaries who had an active political life of about a decade between two organizations, HRA and HSRA. That is, yeah, and he starts out first as a satyagrahi in non-cooperation. So from about 1921 to 1930, yeah, so it's a decade long, little less than a decade long active revolutionary life. And most revolutionaries, active revolutionaries, did not see themselves as lasting in the field for more than 2 years. So this a decade was actually long for an active revolutionary. Now, what it does, so Azad's lives actually widens the canvas of historical inquiry by bringing together both the organizations and their literature and an entire decade in one frame. Then another unique thing about Azad was, and he was very proud of it, that he evaded police through and arrest throughout his life and spent much of his life underground. So this actually allows us to imagine revolutionary life beyond prison and courtroom, because a lot of history, and my next book is also about courtroom and prison. So a lot of revolutionary history is devoted to looking at prison history or the courtroom. So this actually helps us step out of that. And most important thing about Azad is that he is not a classic reading and writing revolutionary. He is not an ideologue of the kind that we understand Bhagat Singh to be. And that's what makes him very interesting. Now he's an upper caste he's a Brahmin, who Brahmin boy from a rather impoverished and poor background, from Madhya Pradesh. He runs away from home and goes to Bombay and works as a dockyard laborer. And from there, he travels back to Banaras and enrolls himself in a Sanskrit school there. So he had a life unlike many of the revolutionaries that we read and write about, who are college-going revolutionaries, who are educated. Now, this man did not have that benefit of education, and he was also a classic Behrupia, a trickster. He could don a janeu and a dhoti and a top knot, and with the Bhagavad in his hand, he could become a Kathavachak. Yeah, or he could wear a simple cap and a dhoti and turn into a regular, well-to-do baniya. Or he could wear a dirty undershirt and a thick dhoti and masquerade as a domestic servant, which he did. These are all the different, attires that he took on. Or he could dress in a khaki uniform and pass off as a police constable. So Azad actually defines the frameworks that are available to us to understand who a revolutionary is. So he was a tricky fellow to write about, and he fit the frame for me because he, looking at him and several others, I was like, okay, they are not fitting into the frame that I understand. So what is their frame? How do we understand this kind of ontology? So, and Azad was also an organizer. He was a strategist, and as a leader he was connected to several young men. So his life actually allows us a deeper access into the lives and relationships of wider set of HSRA and HRA revolutionaries. And another important thing about Asad is that his life gives us a corrective to an excessive historical focus on HSRA, which was Bhagat Singh's, the organization that he formed with Bhagat Singh. Also, the individual revolutionary figure of Bhagat Singh as the sole lens for studying revolutionism in North India. And also, it allows us to look at materials which are not generated simply by the associates of Bhagat, such as Yashpal. So, it allows me to it. In order to study Azad, I had to look at a lot more material, yeah, which was different, unknown, and unheard. Like historians haven't drawn upon it as much. So, and that's what looking at Azad made possible. Yeah. Okay. So what does the studying revolutionaries' inner life actually do for us? What does this book do for you if you will pick it up and read it? Now, the first thing that this book does is that it helps. The question I was asking myself was, how do I not write a romantic history of the revolutionaries? So what it does is it dispels the romantic mythicization of the revolutionaries, the myths that have come to it, which have been come to attached, which have been attached with HRA and HSRA revolutionaries, and it happens when you examine their inner lives. Because what I found, you see, their political material shows a unified front. Rarely does the political writings ever tell you about internal differences, discords, and conflicts. So the moment I stepped out of the political materials and started looking at inner lives, what I found was internal differences, internal conflicts. For example, Azad did not share Bhagat's view of mass awakening. Neither did he agree with Bhagat that they should not be carrying out political dacoities. And interestingly, he did not even share Bhagat's understanding of socialism. His relationship to socialism was highly tenuous. He was going along with it. Because it was his faith in Bhagat that made him agree to the insertion of socialism in the title of the party, in the name of the party. So, if one were to ask Azad what is socialism, so there was a couplet that Azad would recite time and again, and I will just read it out to you. Jehi din hoye surajwa, arhar ka dalya dhan ka bathwa, khub khachar ke khawaina. The day sun will shine, we will eat pulses and wheat, we will eat with great gusto. So for Azad, being able to eat well was socialism. That for him was Swaraj in many ways. And similarly, Rajguru could not differentiate between Marx and Rabindranath Tagore. To him, both were kind old gentlemen with beards, and both of them talking nice things. Similarly, there was a greater ambivalence regarding religion. Azad never gave up his sacred thread. He practiced brahmacharya as in the Brahminical frame. And one small anecdote I will tell you here. There was an associate of the HSRA member and associate of Azad, Bhagwan Das Mahor, was one such character whom Bhagat tried to win over to the side of atheism and socialism. So Bhagat would often ply him with books, and then he gave him Bakunin's God and State to read. Mahar couldn't make sense of the book and gave it back, unread halfway. He read it halfway and gave it back, and got into an argument with Bhagat. And here is what Mahar says about his conversation with Bhagat. विरोध में मैं उनको भारतीय दर्शन या वेदांत की दुहाई देकर संस्कृत के श्लोक सुनाने लगता था. So when he would get tired of listening to Bhagat's argument, he would fall back on some Vedantic knowledge and Sanskrit shlokas. And in return, Bhagat would start reciting Jai Hanuman Gyan Gun Sagar, Hanuman Chalisa to tease Mahor. Because according to Bhagat, Mahor had a monkey face. So for the monkey, he had to sing Hanuman Chalisa because nothing else would make sense to him. So this was just some anecdotes to show what their inner lives were like. Not everyone was sold on the idea of atheism. Not everybody understood what socialism meant. Now, many of them also saw themselves as different from the Indian communists and the Bengali revolutionaries. They did not find it easy to come together with them. And the book, in some places, goes into details about how they were different, how did they think about themselves being different. Now, the second thing that the inner lives do is it reflects on the relationship between praxis and ideology. Yeah. Now, often we presume ideology to be driving praxis. But praxis is a technical term for the lay audience. Praxis, we can say lived reality, lived lives, or practice. Yeah. The word praxis means all of these. So often we presume ideology to be driving praxis. But in the case of many of these revolutionaries, it was praxis that was the fount of their ideology. So, what one sees in these memoirs, in their inner lives, is the production of revolutionary self through the actual act of living, not through the world of ideas, through the actual act of living, and in turn, production of the world through this lived act, through the lived reality. So, revolutionary would say that I am a revolutionary when he lived as one. Yeah. So it flips. In the memoirs, you see the frame flipping. When I entered the memoirs, I was looking for ideology. Each page I would turn, I was looking at ideas. I wanted to know what revolution meant to them. I wanted to know what Swaraj meant to them. But actually, the memoirs are surprisingly ambivalent about the purported nature of the Swaraj that was to come, or even the idea of revolution. Yeah? So, and this actually helps us question the idea of revolution as an event. Yeah, it allows us to think of revolution as a process, as a lived reality. Yeah. And it also questions the idea of failure of revolutionism, idea of failure and or of revolutionism being a failed history. Because the question it raises is, from whose perspective, from whose perspective are we thinking of failure? Because in the view of the revolutionaries, they had not failed. They were revolutionaries without a revolution, but they were the way they were constituting themselves at a level of everyday. What Professor Pallad said about the purity of the praxis, the praxis, the anushilan, made them successful. So it was really history, in their opinion, and other Indian nationalists who had failed them. It's not them. Yeah. And so I'll just close my presentation with one last idea that I explore in the book. And it is one of the major ideas. And I hope you enjoy it when you read it. So, if one were to ask what was the main element of the revolutionaries' inner lives, now the fact that they were waiting tells us that time was the main element in the revolutionary ontology. Yeah. Now, their relationship with time was reflected in their observance of political asceticism in their daily life. And this practice of asceticism, which is basically a strict moral code and a social code about how to live, how to be, what to wear, what not to eat, how to behave with each other, and all of that. So the practice of asceticism allowed them to transcend what they saw as their imperfect present, and it also shortened. So they saw their present as imperfect, and the daily practice of asceticism actually allowed for the recreation of that perfection in their very present. And it also allowed them to detach themselves from the imperfections of time. And the imperfection of time was really the rhythm of industrial time, and giving up their lifestyles as upper caste men, or at least questioning their socio-cultural upbringing. So detaching themselves and their lifestyles and the collective from the imperfections of the time was their attempt at Swaraj. So Swaraj held a double meaning for them. One was the political Swaraj, the Purna Swaraj, but then there was the other Swaraj, which was over the self. And this relationship with time was also reflected in their embrace of violence. Now, a lot has been written on violence and how the revolutionaries understood it. But I make a small argument here that actually their embrace of violence as a political tool was reflecting their relationship with time, because it actually shortened. What violence did was to shorten the time distance to their political utopia. They could arrest the wheels of history and drive it in a different direction with their violence. So, what asceticism and violence allowed these revolutionaries was a temporal mobility, yeah, which allowed them to achieve Swaraj on a daily basis, where the organization became a microcosm of a perfected state of Swaraj. So, a little esoteric, little abstract, but the chapter in which I write about it, I call them the Kal Yodhas. So they saw themselves as warriors, but they also saw themselves as time warriors. They were rushing against a certain kind. They were holding the time back from hurtling towards a certain future. Yeah, and they had to tease it away from that and take it in another direction. So the time was their foe. Time was also their friend. Yeah, and time is what they lived by. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Aparna. That was a lot in such a short time, a whole book condensed in half an hour. Wonderful. It's interesting that you talk about these people who are not to be considered as people who elaborated ideas. That the great preoccupation of all historians is, well, what are the ideas of these revolutions? What is their ideology, and so on. But remarkably, you have given us just that, what their ideas were. about leading an ascetic life, how to create themselves, how to enact their revolution, and how to accelerate the process of history. So actually, a whole set of ideas do come out of it, although they are not considered people of ideas. Now, it's unusual that this is coming from a group of people from the left. Normally, people who are accused of not having ideas or who say that they do not have specific ideologies are conservatives. They always say, I'm not interested in ideologies, ideas, theories, and so on. And of course, they elaborate a whole set of theories in the course of saying so. And that is what conservative theory and ideology always is. And the left is famous for always elaborating theory. There have to be theorists, otherwise they cannot be on the left. Everything is theoretically worked out. And the more they work it out theoretically, the more they disagree with each other and they become sectarian. This is the disease of the left. But here we have a set of people who are on the extreme left, who are consciously not people who are elaborating an ideology. And so you have to work out their ideology the way you have done. Indeed, you have done. And it is through their praxis, as you said, that their ideas come out. So that itself is an interesting exercise. On the left, a group of people whose ideas are distilled from their praxis rather than from what they wrote about it, and people who did not wish to write about it. So thank you very much for that. Let me invite Himanshu, Professor Himanshu Ray, to give her comments, and then we'll go on to the question and answer. Himanshu.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Chairperson. And thank you very much, Aparna, for that excellent lecture. I have read the book and I have enjoyed reading the book. But before I raise some or ask for some clarifications, let me also say, as both of you know very well, I'm really an outsider. I don't do modern Indian history. My perspective is more based on ancient history. And hence, for me, this was a very different take that you presented. But having said that, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. And I like the way you have framed the book. By that, I mean that there are, in addition to the inner lives of the revolutionaries, which you talked about and which you presented just now, there is also the various strands that get mingled or that get integrated into the book. And these strands draw from various writings that you quote, for example, Anand Math by Bankim, or, like you mentioned, the histories of Russian revolutionaries. And you also bring in various opinions of modern Indian historians who've written on these issues. And finally, of course, one point which you didn't talk about, but which comes out in the book, is the relevance, or should one say, the larger questions that this book raises about the way we see contemporary protests, or the way in which various protests more within our times are dealt with. So in a way, even though the book is strictly, it strictly is about Swaraj and the inner lives of revolutionaries, it has a much larger canvas and a much larger questions that it raises. So really drawing from the book rather than the talk, which was focused more on the revolutionaries, let me ask you for clarifications on 2 or 3 points. One is the question of the celebration of the revolutionary. And in the book, you talk about the fact that it is the Amar Chitra Katha, which and such writings which celebrated the revolutionaries. Now, I, with my sort of inadequate knowledge, would tend to either raise the question or disagree with this, because somehow I see that the Amar Chitra Katha, it was founded much later. It was founded 20 years after independence in 1967. It was a private enterprise. It had very different focus. It was meant only for publicizing Indian history, culture, and epic literature. So if it celebrates the revolutionaries, I would not hold it against the against the graphics produced by the Amar Chitra Katha. But I would suggest that isn't it that we need to go back to 1945 to look at the celebration of revolutionaries and to really look at the U-turn that was done by the Congress with reference to the INA trials that were held or were purported to be held at the Red Fort. So that's one of my specific questions, that why the Amar Chitra Katha, and why not the sort of longer framework, because the celebration in my sort of frame of reference really started with 1945. Because as I understand it, the Congress had distanced itself from the revolution by about 30s or 35. My second question is regarding the historiography, and thanks a lot for the way you've presented it and the larger questions that you raise. But the issue is that historians, in a certain way, have been selective, not just about revolution, but about the way they have presented the past of the Indian nation state. And I draw your attention to the fact that there are a lot of writings on the Mauryan king Ashoka, starting from politicians themselves, Nehru himself, Jawaharlal Nehru, and his book. The fact that Ashokan symbols are there, as are national symbols. The fact that the nation state, in a way, saw itself not in the mode of revolution or violence, but in a non-violent mode, and the supposed, the word is wrong, secular mode, rather than as a protest, which was fine against the colonial state, but was not, in a way, quite. One couldn't sort of continue this with a democratically elected government. So really, then historians are selective, and there is also the silence then, and the celebration of non-violence, not just Gandhi's non-violence, but also going all the way back to the Mauryas, the 3rd century BCE king Ashoka, that sort of lays the foundation of a sort of non-violent civilization as the Indian nation state saw it. And my final question, and then I will stop, is the use of the word revolutionary itself. And you have a chapter which talks about, from Satyagrahi to Krantikari. And the way I haven't read the larger literature that you refer to, but certainly, and it's true, you're right, that many of the pamphlets talk about revolution, say Sanyal's pamphlet that you quote in 1924. But when I look at the titles of the memoirs that you draw on, they don't talk about revolution. They don't talk about revolutionaries. And I would rather think that they talk about satyagrahis. So my final point really is that the way you have drawn out the discussion on socialism, which I enjoyed very much, and where you showed how the term itself changes its meaning over time. I'm sure, and you know better, that the term revolutionary and revolution also changed its meaning. And the way we see it today and draw on the past and sort of, should one say that, use the present to read the past and treat the people you talk about, whom I would call satyagrahis, as revolutionaries. I think there is a lot that one could have done with greater detail on changes in the meaning itself. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much, both for the lecture and for the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Very much, Himanshu. That is a good extended comment at all. Very useful. And would you care to respond to that quickly? We've got some questions coming up.
Thank you for unmuting me, Vasan. Very quickly, I'll respond to these because
Yes.
I think there are more questions coming in.
Yeah, there are questions coming.
Yeah. So regarding the Amar Chit Katha question, now Amar Chit Katha is, I agree with that. It's not the first time. We already have several movies being made before this.
Mm.
So I think with Amar Chit Katha, the point I was trying to make was more about how they are celebrated in a particular framework. With the coming of with the writing of the Amar Chit Katha, there is a different kind of a framework in which they are getting absorbed. Yeah, and this framework has very much to do with socialism. Yeah, and there is a very nice article by Harleen Singh on, where she does a deeper analysis of the Amar Chit Kathas of Chandrasekhar Azad and Jatin Baga, to show how they are now being these imageries or these popular comic books or series that many children are reading at that time are actually juxtaposed to the violence, or the violence that is actually occurring in the civil society from late 1960s onwards. And in a way it is to so it's juxtaposed to that, to say that, look, here are sons of India, they shed their blood for India, and here you are taking on the state for which they shed their blood. Yeah, so I think that is the context for Amar Chit
Okay.
Katha, and I draw on it because it's one of those popular book series that most of us were familiar with, and it's helping me enter the story of the 1970s. What happens in the appropriation and commemoration of the revolutionaries that begins in the 1970s, and that runs parallel, or that is intertwined with the commemoration that the surviving revolutionaries and their families start engaging in from 1970 in this period. So I think somewhere I mentioned about Chanshek exhuming the ashes, or bringing the ashes and taking them through the city, and all that, processions being
Yeah,
taken,
yeah,
and Vidhivat Sanskar being done, and all that. So this is a very 70s phenomenon. So how do we understand this? So I thought, I used it as an entry point. And Amar Chit Katha also leaves in place, it never really questions their upper caste status, the Janeu, and easily brings all that into the socialist frame. So the conflation or the invisibilization that happens there is also interesting in the Amar Chit Katha. So that's, from that point of view, it's valuable. But yes, the commemoration begins much before.
yeah.
Mm.
Thanks.
And silence about let me talk about the revolutionary
Yeah,
word.
sure.
Yes, the word has changed. So
Mm.
at the time that Peter Hughes was writing about it, or even the classic essay by Bipin Chandra in the Modern India book, the term that is used is revolutionary terrorist, and there has been plenty of controversy about it. Yeah, the term made historical sense at the time they used it, but now it's got mired in several controversies. So what has happened in historiography now, like
Sure.
Kama's work,
Yeah.
Daniel's work, I think all of us have just simply dropped the word terrorist, because post 9/11 it has acquired a different meaning. So
Yes.
has the word. So there has been a sort of a what's that new word everybody uses these days? There is a reclaiming of the word revolutionary for these folks. That has happened.
Mm.
Yeah. So yes, I agree that the word has changed, the meaning has changed, but I could have spent a lot of time talking about the word itself. But I was
Yeah,
like,
that's
okay,
true.
I'm going to go with what they thought themselves as.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So I think
wasn't the
that's
word
what,
terrorist? Wasn't the word terrorist dropped in the 80s itself? Did it become
by
militant in India?
1980. Is that a trick question, Professor Palat?
All right.
I'm assuming you giving me an
All right. There are questions waiting. Shall
A.
I
Okay.
bring them up?
Yeah.
Okay. From Arup Gupta in Vietnam. Wonderful. Wonderful presentation. I'm reading out. What was your criteria to choose the revolutionaries that you did?
Okay. So, well, I told you that mine is a long journey with history of violence. So I actually began with researching Gaddarites, and that's the time I was in USA, and I was working there and living there, and I turned and I could see the impact of 9/11 on that society. And there was an increasing push towards looking at histories of violence, and also I wanted to connect back home in a different way. So my journey started with looking at histories of violence and histories of nationalism. So I gravitated towards the Gaddarites. So for 3 4 years, actually, I spent looking at records of the Gaddar party, and a famous trial called the Franz Bopp trial, which happened in America, or the Indo-German conspiracy. I spent time looking at it. But that's the time I also traveled to India for field work. Yeah, and once I came here, what I had done in US stopped making sense. Yeah, and here I started looking at Gandhi murder trial. And then in the archives one day, I found a personal correspondence of a revolutionary who had actually become a renegade, who had testified against Bhagat Singh and Sukhdev in the trial. So his personal correspondence is now there in National Archives. And one famous journalist, Kuldeep Nayyar, is the only one who's looked at it before. So when I saw that correspondence, and in that he talked about his inner life, like he talked about why he became a renegade. Yeah, that sort of decided me, okay, I'm going to work on HSRA. Yeah, because that's the story I wanted to tell. So I wrote one essay on it, one journal article on the Renegade Revolutionary, and it's going to appear again in my next book on. So the idea of betrayal and the inner life, it started from there, and then I began to collect these memoirs. So I traveled to the archives in Lucknow, and I met one of the sons of HRA revolutionaries. His name is Sri Uday Khatri, and he gave me several of these commemorative volumes. And I was like, how do I write about it without writing a heroic commemorative history of the revolutionaries? How do I not romanticize them? So that then became the question for me. So slowly, this grew on me. And Chandrasekhar Azad is not an obvious figure that one writes about. So, but then I was like, okay, what holds it all together? It's Azad. So, the topic just evolved over a period of time. Yeah, and thank you for that question.
From Yogendra Kumar in Noida. I would imagine that any revolutionary activity would entail political mobilization for mass impact. Request comment.
Not entirely, not always. Because for the Professor Pallad can speak to this. Do you want to? You look very. You look. Go ahead. You can get this better than me.
No, why should a revolutionary? No, but I think he wants your opinion, not mine.
Okay. Well, mine won't be very different. So, revolutionary activity more often than not tends to be underground, especially of the kind that you see in 1920s in India. And so they are very much like as Professor Palat had said, in 1880s, you have these narodniks in Russia. Yeah. And the HSRA, Bhagat Singh and Azad and all these people, they are less like the Bolsheviks, but more like the narodniks. Yeah. So they are thinking about mass impact, but the actual work is not at that level. The work is underground, it's secret. There can be mass contact through night schools, through reading groups, through work in the villages and all of that. But the mobilization, so that's the next stage, and our revolutionaries didn't reach that stage.
Most revolutionaries are not mass mobilizers. That's the trouble. Of course, they're lucky if they got it, but usually they weren't. From the histories of revolutions that we see. No, not all. I mean, that's another matter. Okay, thank you very much. Question from Ananya Dasgupta in Chennai. Thank you, Aparna. Really enjoyed your talk. Could you talk just a bit more about the gendered writing of history? Now that you have looked into the inner lives of the revolutionaries, something, as you say, feminist scholars tend to do, how would you sum up the re-gendering of the revolutionaries?
Okay, thank you for that question. Um, okay, I have to think on my feet and answer quickly. So here is the answer that I can think of immediately. So, after a point, the way the revolutionaries talked about love became something I began to look for in the memoirs. So they talk a lot about love, and it's not always brotherly love, but it is not homosexual love either. Okay, so and that's the time I actually had to dip back into a little bit of gender theory and read about it, and I found this one reference I'm forgetting, but there's one paragraph I found which actually said that even if the love was brotherly, all revolutionaries loved men. Yeah, maybe not in a sexual way, but what they aspired to, what they held as dear, whom they wanted to be with, everything was male. So we need to expand our definition of homoeroticism. Yeah, this was a different kind of a. Professor Ray, do you want to come in?
No, I'm fine. No,
Uh,
thanks.
okay. So re-engendering of revolutionaries is so in that much that even if my primary sources, even if the memoirs I'm looking at will never ever talk about it in that manner, but there was the but then as historians we need to reconfigure the categories that we are working with. So that would be my first response. And the other is that inner lives are important, they are constitutive. Yeah, so and in order to be able to write like this, I had to question some of my own understanding of how I was seeing the revolutionaries. I began with seeing the inner domain as feminine, therefore politically inconsequential. So I think with the writing of the book, I made my own journey with understanding revolution, understanding revolutionaries, notions of gender, and how they play into the lives of these revolutionaries. Yep.
Well, thank you. To continue on that point, it is interesting that revolution always considered it important to liberate sexually. From the French Revolution onward, and then especially culminating in the Russian Revolution, they always said liberation has to be across the board. Now, what you've introduced is another theme, that this is all amongst men, and there could be a culture of male companionship which engenders homoeroticism. Now, if you go back in history, there are so many groups of heroic men uh, uh, fighting for various causes or working for religious upliftment, but always male groups entirely. And this theme comes up again and again, that they're locked in male company, their ideals are so masculine. That doesn't mean homosexuality, but there's something else to it.
Yes.
The revolution, as it set out, continued from the French Revolution onward, did not engender this type, unless, of course, it was a very special underground male group, male companionship. And this could happen. I mean, one of these features of it could be this way. So that's an interesting extra dimension to it, which you have brought out, which I think has not been discussed in the context of our political and revolutionary history.
Yeah.
Perhaps not.
Yeah. Maybe we need to redefine the idea of friendship. There has
Yeah.
been work on that. Leela Gandhi's book is there, and Alan Bray's very famous book on friendship, male friendship, is there. So, and I call them in one place "friends in arms," which is meant to be a double entendre, a pun. Um, uh, and I leave it to the reader's imagination to think what that refers to. So, because it's unclear, it's left unstated. Yeah, so like in one place, this one writer says about Bhagat Singh and Sukhdev that everything that was there in the name of love, Sukhdev had given to Bhagat. And I was like, this sounds highly passionate. But, I can't go out and just say that this is homosexuality. This could be homoeroticism of a different kind. Yeah. So, yes.
Okay. I think that's about it. And I think we have come to the end of our time. Do we have any more questions coming up? Any more?
There's
Anybody
one.
There's one question. I think it has been partially answered from Poonam and Coimbatore. What is a common thread amongst the revolutionaries' thinking? But I think that you have already, in one way or the other, already dealt with. Do you wish to now say anything further, or shall we wind up? Yeah.
Good. Professor A?
I don't see any more questions. Yeah. Himanshu, you wish to?
No. I mean, at some point I'll talk to Aparna about sannyas, which she brings up. But, Madhavan, the point you raised, I think that not in the same way, but one could push it much further back. But that's another issue completely. I think I'm fine.
Which point are you talking of? Which point I raised?
The point about revolutionaries, male companionship and male associations, and they being there in society. And Aparna does talk about asceticism and sannyas, but she does talk about it as warriors, as warrior ascetics, but not simply as associations where men lived and worked for society in different ways. Yeah.
There is a long tradition of this warrior ascet. There is a long tradition of warrior asceticism, but their asceticism does not always imply brahmacharya.
No, that's true.
That's true. So I think there is a conflation between the two categories, and once we discard this idea of brahmacharya, then it becomes easier to historically understand asceticism.
Exactly.
And if you're looking at Azad, then he's the brahmacharya variety.
Yes.
But he's also the enforcer of that. And these are ideals that they aspire to, but are not able to live by always. That's again the thing to remember. Like, it is not like they want to be ascetics, but not a fait accompli in that way.
Yeah.
Of us can live by all the ideals we espouse. So there are no exception to that. Okay. Thank you so much for a very stimulating discussion on a subject which is of the greatest interest to us today, especially as revolution has not come to an end, and it can keep on resurfacing in this country. And these revolutions have had an afterlife in more recent times, which we did not have time to discuss, because their images appeared in the most recent agitations and so on in favor of the Constitution. So it always gives us something more to talk about and more to think about, especially when you discuss that inner lives. The inner life of exploration is so complex and infinite. It goes in all directions. And we've just touched upon some aspects of it. There are so many others. Always the interesting question is, what motivates them? What actually makes them throw themselves into this kind of a life of such extreme privation, but extreme idealism at the same time? And how they see themselves and how they carry it out. And I think you've given us a wonderful insight into this, of a very important type of person, which will always appear in our histories. It is by no means over, finished with. We are going to see such people again in some way or the other. And this will be a most useful and interesting introduction to that. Thank you very much, Aparna, for your wonderful book and for your talk. And thank you, Himanshu, for your generously commenting on the book and maintaining the discussion. And I think that's it. Shall we now close?
Yes, please.
Okay.